Seemingly normal families who committed grisly crimes, secret deadly love affairs, real-life houses of horror. These are 10 disturbing family secrets that will horrify you.
Gerald and Alice Uden weren't each other's first loves. In fact, they were far from it. Both of them had been married before they met, and both of them had a secret. In 1974, Alice Uden was a mother married to a man named Ronald Holtz. But less than a year and a half later, Alice filed for divorce. Only problem was, Holtz was nowhere to be found. In 1980, Gerald Uden was married and a stepfather to 2 sons, until one day both his wife and her sons mysteriously vanished. When Gerald and Alice met, they fell in love and started a life together. They went to church and engaged in pleasant conversations with their neighbors, one of which was quoted saying, "They're the kind of neighbors you leaned over the fence and talked about your chickens with." They were, as far as anyone knew, the definition of the wholesome old couple next door. But all of that changed when the pair entered their 70s. It was then that Alice's son Todd told police that his mother had once admitted to killing his father, her husband, and hiding the body in a gold mine. After the shocking revelation about Alice came out, police decided to begin looking into Gerald's past, which is when they found out that the pair had way more in common than previously thought. Gerald confessed to killing his ex-wife and her 2 sons with a hunting weapon she had actually gotten him as a present. Gerald was charged with killing in the first degree, and Alice, who claimed to have killed her husband in an act of self-defense, was charged with man 1.
Joseph Tarricone was a man from the US who, in the 80s, was involved in a truly horrifying family scandal that went under the radar for decades. Joseph Tarricone was a man from the US who in the late 70s was involved in a truly horrifying family scandal that went under the radar for decades. Tarricone disappeared in 1978 after visiting his daughter in Hawaii. For nearly 30 years, no one knew what happened to him. His entire family was left completely in the dark. But the truth was finally uncovered in 2007. Tarricone had been in a relationship with a woman named Renee Curtis at the time of his disappearance. When the relationship started to sour, Curtis and her brother Nicholas Notaro decided to get rid of him. Notaro fired at Tarricone twice in the head. To cover up the crime, he and Curtis dismembered the body with a chainsaw and buried the remains. And the secret remained buried until construction workers discovered the body parts while demolishing Curtis's old house. Yeah, for some reason they figured home would be the best place to keep a dead body. Notaro admitted to the killing and was sentenced to life in prison. Curtis also confessed to helping dispose of the body, but denied having any involvement in planning the crime. Despite her claims though, she was also given a full life sentence.
In 1983, UK dentist Colin Howell and housewife Hazel Stewart were madly in love. Only problem was they were married and not to each other. After a while of hiding their affair and many repeated attempts at reconciling their own respective marriages, the two came up with a plan: to kill their current spouses and run away together. In 1991, Colin Howell poisoned his wife to death with carbon monoxide before arriving at his mistress, Hazel Stewart's house. In 1991, Colin Howell poisoned his wife to death with carbon monoxide before arriving at his mistress, Hazel Stewart's house, his wife's body in hand. When Colin arrived, Stewart set her half of the plan into action and did the same thing to her husband Howell had done to his wife. After both of their prospective spouses were dead, Howell and Stewart staged a scene. They propped both of the bodies up in a car in Stewart's garage to make it seem as though the pair had taken their own lives. And after all that, Howell and Stewart went their separate ways. Colin Howell eventually remarried and for a while lived a relatively normal life until one day he confessed his crime to his new wife. At first, she urged him to keep quiet for the sake of their family, but eventually, after Howell fell into some financial troubles and began cheating again, his wife changed her mind and ultimately turned Howell into the police. He received a prison term of 21 years and his co-conspirator Hazel Stewart a minimum of 18 years behind bars.
Skidmore, Missouri is a very small town with a very big, dark secret, and it's not just one family's secret, it's the entire town's. This is the case of Ken Rex McElroy, the boogeyman of Skidmore, whose story almost plays out like a real-life version of Nightmare on Elm Street. So back in the 60s and 70s, Skidmore was ruled by a man named Ken McElroy, who is infamous for being a total bully and a criminal. He pretty much ran the town, and for over 2 decades, He reigned over it like a mad dictator. He'd steal from local farmers and businesses, commit violence on townsfolk at will, and engaged in all sorts of other criminal behavior. He also had multiple wives, many of whom he'd just taken unwillingly. With the help of a mob-connected lawyer, McElroy was virtually untouchable, intimidating anyone who dared to press charges. He would stalk people, kill people's pets, burn homes and businesses to the ground in order to maintain his grip on the town. By July of 1981, though, people had had enough. A mob of fed-up locals who'd endured years of his terror surrounded him in the center of town and opened fire. McElroy was shot dead, but not one of the more than 50 witnesses came forward to identify who pulled the trigger, and no one was ever arrested. To this day, every single witness has refused to talk, and the case remains unsolved.
Diane Staudte lost her husband and her son and witnessed her daughter grow incredibly ill in the span of just 1 year. Her husband passed without warning, seemingly of natural causes. Her son died of what seemed to be seizure-related complications, and one of her daughters, Sarah, was rushed to hospital requiring emergency attention for flu-like symptoms that later revealed themselves to be the result of organ failure. While one might think Diane to have been crushed by this dark series of unfortunate events, many were surprised and deeply disturbed to notice how cheerful she remained throughout the entirety of each ordeal. At the funeral of both her husband and her son, she seemed pretty unmoved and, as I said to some, almost happy. When her daughter almost lost her life to organ failure, Diane spent the majority of her time in the hospital making jokes about going on vacation. All of this strange behavior eventually led people to suspect that the deaths and illnesses that occurred in the family were no mere fluke of nature, but rather the doing of Diane herself. It turns out Diane had actually been conspiring with her other daughter Rachel to kill off the rest of the family one by one until only the two of them remained. For their crimes, both women were sentenced to life behind bars.
This next story comes to us from a now deleted Reddit user, and if this is true, it's absolutely nuts. So it goes like this. My uncle was working near Vancouver on a farm. He had been working there for a while, while my dad worked on a different farm not too far away. Well, the guy my uncle worked for had a bunch of pigs and would often have pig roasts and invite a bunch of people over. He would also sell the pork to people in nearby towns. Well, at the same time, a bunch of women were going missing. After a while, my uncle left and didn't speak to the man again. Turns out, the farmer had killed 49 women and fed them to his pigs. He'd also mixed them with the pork that he sold. So basically, my uncle and many people were unknowingly eating people. End of post. So there was a very real case where this happened. Robert Pickton's the man. We've talked about him before on the channel. One of the most disgusting serial killers in history. So if this Redditor's story is true, his uncle knew the guy, and not only that, he may have eaten human remains on more than one occasion. That is crazy.
The first time Charlie Brandt ever claimed a life was in January of 1971. He was young and filled with rage. In a fit of violence, he claimed the life of his mother and attempted to claim the life of his father by firing a weapon at both of them multiple times. He would have taken the life of his sister too, but his weapon jammed and she was able to fight him off. While you'd think this would be the end of the story, it unfortunately isn't. Because of Charlie Brandt's age, prosecutors declined to charge him, and eventually he, his father, and his sister just decided to put the incident behind them, which is probably the dumbest thing I've heard all year, and they went about their lives like nothing had happened. In 2004, Brandt and his wife Terry were staying with Terry's niece Michelle in Orlando, which is when, in an act of unprovoked violence, Brandt impaled his wife several times in the chest before moving on to attack Michelle. After he was satisfied and positive that both Terry and Michelle were dead, he took his own life. After his death, police linked Brandt to the 1989 killing of a woman named Sherry Parisho, and while he has not yet been linked to the death of any others, police are incredibly inclined to believe that Brandt's hit list is a lot longer in real life than it is on paper.
Fred and Rose West were a British couple who, on the surface, seemed like any other suburban family. I mean, looking at this photo, would you ever think they were responsible for a string of heinous, sickening, disturbing crimes? Fred, maybe, he kind of has that sinister grin, but Rose, she looks like a sweet librarian or a school teacher. But in this case, she was just as involved in the crimes as her husband was. Behind their seemingly normal public image was a house of horrors, and the couple would begin being investigated in 1992. Neighbors and friends saw them as an average couple, raising their family, running a business. To the outside world, they were just another hard-working family, but the reality was far more sinister. The Wests were involved in a series of horrific crimes, including the killings of several young women who would endure horrendous torment beforehand, and they'd hide their remains in the cellar or the garden. In 1994, police were investigating the disappearance of their daughter, Heather. What police were not expecting to find were numerous bodies buried around their property. The couple were arrested and charged. Fred took his own life in 1995, and Rose is still rotting away in prison where she belongs.
In 1893, John List, a former military man, moved into a massive mansion in Westfield, New Jersey, accompanied by his mother, his wife Helen, their daughter Patricia, and their sons Frederick and John Jr. For a while, they lived happily, but by November of 1971, things had taken a serious turn for the worst. John, who had already been experiencing some pretty severe financial difficulties, lost his job, and he snapped. While his daughter and sons were out of the house, he took the life of his mother and his wife. When his daughter Patricia and his son Frederick arrived home, he took their lives too. And then he stopped to make some lunch. After finishing up in the kitchen, he drove away from his home, picked up his remaining son John Jr., took him back to the home, and, as you can probably guess, took his life too. After that, he placed the bodies of his wife, his daughter, and his two sons in sleeping bags in the mansion's ballroom. He left his mother in her room in the attic, and then he skipped town. In 1989, John remarried, and in 1990, he confessed to his crime, saying that he had only killed his family because he believed it was better to send them to heaven rather than have them share in his financial hardships, a sentiment shared by absolutely no one. For his crimes, John List was given 5 consecutive life sentences, although in the end, he only spent about 18 years in prison, the same number of years it took to catch him, because he died in his cell on March 21st of 2008 at the age of 82.
The Monniers were a very wealthy family living in Poitiers, France. They were of noble origin, they were well respected and happy. But in 1876, everything changed. Louise Monnier's daughter, Blanche, had gone missing. She and Blanche's older brother, Marcel, were incredibly worried. None of her friends knew where she was. She never left a note. It was as if she'd just vanished into thin air. 25 years passed, and then there was no sign of Blanche, and Marcel and Louise had more or less accepted that they'd never see her again. In May of 1901, the Paris Attorney General received an anonymous letter, though, reading, "Monsieur Attorney General, I have the honor to inform you of an exceptionally serious occurrence. I speak of a spinster who is locked up in Madame Monnier's house, half-starved and living on a putrid litter for the past 25 years. In a word, in her own filth." When police went to investigate, what they found was, shockingly, exactly what was detailed in the letter. An emaciated woman locked up in a small room where she'd been for the last 25 years. Blanche Monnier. She'd been locked away by her very own mother, and Marcel knew about it as well. But why? Well, it was all because Blanche had wanted to marry a man that the rest of the family didn't approve of.
Well, that was disturbing.
Yeah, you may want to think twice about looking through your old family albums or going up in the attic and seeing what's up there. You may not like what you find, but let us know if you do find anything interesting.
Yeah.
We'll see you in the next one.
Cheers, friends.